Marie Antoinette was the Queen of France, and she went to her execution on the guillotine with calm and quiet. She was a woman who was hated across the nation for the fact many blamed her and her husband, the executed King Louis XVI, for the problems across the nation. Whilst the royal family were having lavish parties and celebrations, many people were starving on the streets, and when the revolution broke out, no one could have predicted that the king and the queen would have been executed. The guillotine execution device was even championed by Marie's husband, yet it was the slanted blade that took her head clean off. On the 16th of October 1793, she was taken up to the scaffold, and her final words were, "Pardon me, sir, I did not mean it," as she accidentally stood on the foot of her executioner, the man who would release the blade. Her execution was considered a success, as the blade fell upon her neck. But she died on the same day that she had been sentenced to death. But what did Marie Antoinette wear to her execution that day? It was on the 14th of October 1793 that Marie Antoinette was brought to the Revolutionary Tribunal to answer a number of charges. Many believed she would be exiled, but some historians have claimed that her fate had already been decided by the Committee of Public Safety beforehand. She was accused of many crimes, including declaring her son the new King of France, incest, sending money to Austria, and stealing from the national treasury, planning a massacre of the National Guards, and then also treason. She was found guilty and was then condemned to death, and she refused to submit to a plea with this, but she had been sentenced to death for 3 main charges: high treason, depleting the national treasury, and also conspiracy against the security of the French nation and state. The authorities may have decided to execute her quickly, as there may have been a concern that she would be rescued from an Austrian force. But following her trial, she was sent back to prison, and in these hours she wrote a letter to her sister-in-law, and she also in this expressed her love for her children. This letter never got to Madame Elizabeth, its intended recipient, and she also had written a will, which was then given to Robespierre. But then the time came for the Queen to prepare for her execution. She was forced to undress in front of her guards, which was very humiliating, and Marie wanted to wear a black dress, as if she was mourning for her life and for the France that she once loved. This had been commissioned for her, and it was in her possession, but the guards did not want this to happen, and they did not want this message being sent to the people. Instead, Marie Antoinette was forced to wear a simple plain white dress, as white was the colour worn by the widowed queens of France for their husbands who had died. This dress was a loose-fitted gown. The Queen was attended on inside of the conciergerie prison, which was said to have been the antechamber to the guillotine, by a girl known as Rosalie, and she gave a good indication and true account as to what the Queen wore. Under her dress, the Queen wore a fresh white chemise nightdress, probably made from silk, and this was an undergarment worn under her dress. This was worn to protect the clothing from sweat and oils, but the chemise she had worn during her trial was stained, and it was allegedly blood-stained, as there is a belief that Marie Antoinette was sick at the time, and she had been hemorrhaging blood at trial, and that she may have actually been suffering with uterine cancer during her final weeks. As well as the white chemise, she also mentioned that she wore a loose, simple white dress which was given to her by the prison guards. Marie also wore on her head a simple white cap, and Rosalie claimed that for her execution she wore the white cap without the mourning decorations which were on this, and she was banned from wearing dark mourning colours or anything of the sort for her execution. The mourning clothes, it was believed, may have caused people to shout insults at her, but the revolutionaries believed that the colour of mourning would actually invoke sympathy for the Queen and would turn a number of people against the revolution. They feared that some would even view Marie Antoinette as a martyr or a saint. As well as this, she allegedly wore black stockings, which were given to her inside of prison. Interestingly, following her execution, her body was buried in a hastily dug grave inside of the Madeleine Cemetery, and these stockings were later discovered in the decades after her execution, as her body was dug up and exhumed. The stockings matched the ones given to her inside of the prison on the day of her execution, and these helped to identify her following the decay of her body and remains, along with some hair which was also found on her head. Marie on her final journey also allegedly wore prunella shoes, a rich purple pair of shoes, and these are allegedly inside of a museum in France, as following her execution they were taken and were then smuggled away to some of her allies who kept them safe. These have a small heel and are in a rather good condition, but there are also some other pairs that have emerged and claim to have been Marie's execution shoes. Finally, around her neck or shoulders, Marie was wearing a white triangular-shaped shawl. We know that Marie wore this in her prison cell, but when Rosalie, her dresser and servants left, it's not known if she wore this shawl at her execution, as something wrapped around her shoulders would have troubled the executioners, and she would probably have had to have removed this. Marie also at this time was forced to have her hair cut short, and this was to prevent issues with the blade falling and then getting cut in her hair, which would then cause her execution to have not been a clean cut. Marie, en route to the execution, was a sorry state, as she processed to the guillotine inside of Paris, and she was forced to sit on a cart, and the people who witnessed the former queen's journey shouted abuse and hatred at her. But she remained silent and fixated on what would come for her, and despite her priest's attempt to speak with her, she uttered no such words and ignored the priest. Marie Antoinette arrived at the guillotine around midday on the 16th of October 1793, and was helped up the steps of the scaffold by the executioner and the guards. Her final words were recorded as, "Pardon me, sir, I did not do it on purpose," and while she was on the scaffold, she accidentally stood on the shoe and foot of the executioner, and she apologised for this. It was certainly not the poignant words that she would have wanted to say, but she was a woman who was clearly fed up with the terrible treatment she had suffered at the hands of the revolutionaries in the years before her execution. It was on this same scaffold that her husband, the king's execution, took place, but she was then strapped to the board and was placed under the guillotine, and quickly the executioner worked, and then released the blade, and the head of the former queen came off in one slice. After this, the executioner then paraded the head of the former queen to the crowd, and one image shows him doing this on a pole as the huge crowd jeered and booed her head. After this, her body and head were collected and were placed inside of a coffin, and she was taken to the Madeleine cemetery to be buried inside of a grave. Madame Tussauds made a quick mask of her face and head, and then she was interred in an unmarked grave. It was no secret where Marie was buried, as in the years following her execution, people often visited from foreign lands to pay their respects to her. But then, decades after her execution, during the brief Bourbon restorations, decisions were made to exhume her and to then inter her remains inside of the royal mausoleum at the Basilica of St. Denis. She was discovered roughly where many documented her grave as being, and Marie's remains were in a better state than her husband's, as some of the quicklime, which was intended to decay her remains, had solidified on top of the coffin and had not actually affected her body. On her remains were found the very stockings she had gone to her execution wearing, and these then helped identify her body, as it was documented she'd been given these, and also these were known as being the stockings given to those who lost their heads on the guillotine. The clothes that Marie Antoinette wore for her execution were aimed to not invoke sympathy for her amongst the French population who saw her execution. The prison guards and authorities did not also allow her to wear black, as they did not want her to be in mourning, so she was forced to wear white. Her fate is one which is very tragic, and many consider today that she did not need to be executed and that she should have instead just been exiled or sent away. At this point in time she had no power and was a little threat, but Robespierre and the other French officials and revolutionaries wanted her dead and executed. They got their wish, and in front of thousands she lost her head on the same blade that her husband did. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.